So the first point that you make is you concede that the apostles died for their faith, but your points about them either being deceived or knowingly living for a lie still hold. But then you go on to state that you concede that the apostles, if they were all 12 of them to hold to a lie under threat of death, that would be inhuman. You know, that would defy all sorts that would just defy logic. Like, how could 12 people hold to the same lie under threat of death? Which really, that puts it on the same level as the resurrection. You know, you have two inhuman things, two things that we don't see as really possible, either 12 people holding to a lie under threat of death, or something supernatural happening, which is the resurrection. So you can see that your point about them living a lie, knowingly living a lie, you can see that does not hold. So what about them being deceived? Could they all have just been deceived and they were tricked into thinking Jesus was resurrected? I'm not inclined to believe that unless some sort of evidence can be presented or some sort of reasoning can be presented of how a resurrection could be faked back in those times when they really didn't have a ton of technology. I mean, nowadays, you could probably fake a resurrection and trick someone who hadn't seen a magician perform before. You'd probably trick them into thinking you had died and rose again. But back then, I mean, that would take technology to do so. But how could you back then, in Jesus' time, fake the resurrection? So present to me how you could fake a resurrection, and I can respond to that. Your next point is about why would God bother to send Jesus to earth if he already knows we're all going to heaven? Like, who is God accountable to do something like that? Why would he send a physical representation of himself to earth? Like, you know, what's the point? And I agree. I believe God to be all-powerful, all-knowing. I'll get into that later. But I still think God has a sense of accountability to what he created, which I think is human beings and the earth and, you know, planets, the universe. I think there is a level of accountability to humans. I don't think that God doesn't have any sort of accountability to us. I think a God would be evil if he didn't have any sort of accountability to taking care of humans and to not necessarily like being involved in human matters, but I think God is somewhat accountable to what he created. I think anything you create, you are accountable to, because that is your creation. And if you're all-powerful and all-knowing, you know how it would be created. So I think you are accountable in a sense. And I think God is accountable in a sense to humans. And then also, God could have sent Jesus as proof for his existence. I think that's also another possibility for why God might have sent Jesus. But I think the best answer I can give you here is I don't know. You know, once again, I don't know why God might have sent Jesus to earth. I can give you two possibilities, but I can't answer that for sure, and no one can. No atheist can answer why God might have sent Jesus. No Christian can answer it. No Muslim can answer it. No one on earth can answer that. We can only speculate. Of course, God's motive for sending Jesus to earth doesn't necessarily disprove or prove the idea that Jesus was resurrected and was sent to earth. But interesting question. I don't really know for sure, but I can only speculate on what God's motives might have been. The next point you make is asking me my thoughts on what I think of God coming to earth in the form of Jesus to experience humanity. And I agree with you about it. I don't think that God would send himself to earth to experience humanity, because of course he wouldn't experience it if he didn't take part in sin. But of course he couldn't take part in sin, because sin by definition is disobedience to himself. So whatever God would do would not necessarily be considered sin. It could only really be considered immoral or wrong. I don't derive morals from what God does, but that's a topic for another video. So yeah, Jesus would have to take part in all of humanity to actually experience it. And of course God is all-knowing, so why would he need to? So yeah, I don't think God came to Earth to experience humanity. I don't think that's a very logical motive to present for why God would come to Earth. The next point you bring up is that you can understand something like Rome or the Holocaust happening. Like, that's in human nature. It's physically possible. I mean, I agree. We can both understand those things and how they could come to be. And they also both have evidence for them. But the difference is, while the resurrection may have evidence for it, which I have presented, it's not physically possible. You can't perceive it as well as you could Rome or the Holocaust. It's not in laws of logic and the laws of nature and things of that sort. I think, and so that should be held, it should be held to a higher standard of evidence. And I agree. I think the resurrection, of course, should be held to a higher standard of evidence because it's something that's supernatural. But of course, the point of the resurrection, you have to remember, is that it's supernatural. So, I mean, if Jesus came to Earth and didn't do something supernatural, that didn't defy, laws of physics, then why would we consider him God? So Jesus would have to do something that's supernatural in order for me and other Christians to think he was God. So I think that's the whole point of the resurrection, is so that it is supernatural. But yeah, I agree. It isn't physically possible for the resurrection to occur, which is the point, because it's not physically possible for any sort of human being to be resurrected with this current technology after 3 days of being dead. But again, that's the whole point of it, is that only God could do that. So yeah, you do have to hold it to a higher standard of evidence. And my views on this, I don't think that Jesus was God 100%. But I do think that the odds are in its favor that Jesus was God. Because I examined the evidence that the apostles agreed that Jesus was God. The apostles died for the fact that Jesus was God. The apostles experienced Jesus being resurrected and saw him, and so did hundreds of other people, which I haven't gone into in this debate, but I don't see it being necessary at this point. So I weigh the evidence, and I say it is supernatural, but there's also physical evidence of it happening. And so it's like you said, we're both looking at the evidence, but we're both drawing different conclusions from the same evidence that we're looking at. It's not like we're disputing what's true and false in the evidence. It's just that we're drawing a different conclusion. And that's really, in my opinion, just because of the fact that I've been raised my entire life having it ingrained in my head that Jesus was God, and you haven't. I don't know for sure if you have or haven't, but I'm assuming that's not something that's been ingrained in your head your entire life. Which makes it very difficult for me to give up my beliefs, and it's not an excuse for why I shouldn't, but it does make it a lot more difficult for me to say my entire belief system that I've held my entire life was a lie, and that almost every one of my friends is living in a lie, and every teacher I've had is living in a lie. That's a very difficult thing for me to admit. So, in that sense, it's going to be much harder for you to convince me that Jesus wasn't God. And in the sense that you haven't had that ingrained in your head, it's much more difficult for me to convince you that Jesus was God. So it's a very difficult debate to have because we both come from different viewpoints and different mindsets on the issue. And that's probably why we've both drawn different conclusions. Had I not been brought up believing that Jesus was God, I might not believe he was God. I don't know. I might not. So it's a difficult thing for me to admit that Jesus wasn't God. I still hold that Jesus was God. I still believe that. I still look at the evidence and say that he was. But I don't know. Had I not been raised a Christian, I might not. So maybe that view will change at some point. I'm not sure. Anyway, the final point you brought up was asking me, what is God? What are we defining God as? Because we really haven't defined God at this point. Because I conceded that God may in fact be evil. You could make the argument that God is evil. And I said, that's a different debate for another time. I define God as all-knowing, all-powerful, and a loving God. That's what I define God as personally. However, I can see that there is evidence against that viewpoint. And I concede that there may be evidence against that point, but I see that as a different debate for another time. So we're coming from the viewpoint that God is all-loving, all-powerful, and all-knowing. If you want to debate that set of issues with me, what is God, I think that's a different debate than was Jesus God. But that's the viewpoint I'm coming from, and you're probably coming from the viewpoint that if God exists, he's probably evil for creating, the suffering that exists on earth. And I understand that viewpoint. I see where you're coming from with that viewpoint. But if you want to debate about that, I think that might be a good debate to have before we debate about other theological subjects. Because getting, what we define God as down first would probably be a good idea before we go into trying to prove God or disprove God or prove Jesus or disprove Jesus. So if you want to have that debate, I'm open to having that debate as well.